My grandmother's kitchen smelled like garlic and tomatoes long before I understood what either of those things meant to our family. Her name was Louisa, and she ran a two-burner stove like it was a symphony. I was maybe 7 years old the first time she let me stir the pot myself, standing on a wooden step stool so I could reach, and she told me the same thing she told my sister Vanessa a year later when it was her turn. This recipe isn't written down anywhere but in your hands and in mine, and one day it belongs to both of you. Vanessa is 2 years older than me, and growing up, we were close in the specific way sisters are close when they've spent every Sunday of their childhood shoulder to shoulder at a stove, arguing over whether the basil went in too early. My name is Naomi, and for most of my life, I would have told you Vanessa was the person I trusted most in the world, more than my parents even, because Vanessa was the one who covered for me, who drove 3 hours to help me move apartments, who called every single Sunday even after I moved across the state for a teaching job. Our grandmother passed when I was 26. She didn't leave much behind, not in the way people usually think of an inheritance. No house, no stocks, no jewelry worth mentioning. What she left was a battered tin recipe box, the kind with a hinged lid and a faded rooster painted on the front, and inside it dozens of index cards in her looping handwriting. The sauce recipe was near the back, stained with decades of use, and at the bottom of the card she'd written a single line I never forgot: "For my 2 girls, together always." Vanessa took the box after the funeral. It made sense at the time. She still lived in our hometown, she had the space, and frankly I was too busy grieving to argue about a tin box. A few years later, she mentioned she was thinking about selling small batches of the sauce at the local farmer's market, just as a hobby, something to keep Grandma's memory alive. I told her that sounded perfect. I even sent her $200 to help cover the cost of jars and labels, because that's what you do for family. That was 4 years ago. I hadn't thought much about the sauce since, beyond the occasional photo Vanessa would post of a farmer's market table with a little handwritten sign. I had my own life going, a classroom full of 9th graders, a fiancé named Theo, a mortgage I was slowly chipping away at. Vanessa and I still talked, though less often than before, and when we did, the sauce rarely came up. I assumed it was still what it had always been described as: a small, sweet side project, a way of keeping our grandmother close. I had no idea how wrong that assumption was until the day I walked into a grocery store 4 hours from my hometown and saw our grandmother's sauce sitting on a shelf under bright supermarket lighting, in a jar I didn't recognize, with a label that didn't have my name on it anywhere. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing special about it. I'd stopped at a chain grocery store on my way home from a parent-teacher conference, tired, thinking about nothing more than what to make for dinner. I was walking down the pasta aisle when a red and gold label caught my eye, the kind of label designed to look rustic and homemade even when it's printed by the thousands. The jar said Louisa's Table, Original Family Marinara. Underneath it, in smaller script, it read: a recipe passed down for generations, now shared with yours. I actually laughed out loud, a short surprised sound, because for a second I thought it was some kind of coincidence. Louisa isn't the most common name, but it isn't rare either. Then I turn the jar over and read the small paragraph on the back, the kind every specialty food brand puts on their packaging to tell a story. It described a woman who grew up cooking beside her grandmother in a modest kitchen, who inherited a family recipe and turned it into a business honoring that legacy. It named the founder. Vanessa's full name, printed clearly, with a small circular photo of her smiling next to a stove that looked suspiciously like our grandmother's old one, the one Vanessa must have kept. There was no mention of me. There was no mention of a sister at all. The story on that jar made it sound like Vanessa alone had inherited the recipe, alone had built the business, alone was carrying our grandmother's memory forward. I stood in that aisle for a long time, jar in hand, feeling something shift in my chest that I couldn't yet name. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more like watching a photograph of your own life with your face cut out of it. I bought the jar, I don't know why exactly, except that I needed proof it was real, that I hadn't imagined it. When I got home, I searched the brand name online, and what I found made my hands go cold. Louisa's Table wasn't a farmer's market table anymore. It hadn't been for at least 2 years. It was a registered company with a real website, a real distribution deal, retail placement in 4 states, and a Our Story page with a professionally shot photo of Vanessa standing in a commercial kitchen that was clearly not the one in her house. I called her that night. She picked up on the 4th ring, sounding distracted, and when I asked her carefully why I was looking at Grandma's sauce in a grocery store 4 hours from home, she went quiet for a second too long before she laughed and said something about how it had gotten a little bigger than expected, and she'd been meaning to tell me. I asked her what a little bigger meant. She changed the subject to ask about the wedding planning instead, and I let her, because some part of me still wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't make my stomach hurt the way it currently did. I tried to let it go for about 2 weeks. I told myself Vanessa had built something, and building something takes courage, and maybe she'd simplified the story for marketing reasons, the way companies do, and maybe there was a plan to bring me in eventually, formally, once things were more stable. I am by nature someone who looks for the kindest explanation first. It's probably why I became a teacher. But the jar sat on my kitchen counter for those 2 weeks, and every time I looked at it, that same cold feeling came back. I started asking around, carefully, the way you do when you're not ready to accuse anyone of anything but you can't stop yourself from gathering pieces. I called my mother, who admitted she'd heard the sauce business was doing really well but hadn't followed the details closely. I called our cousin Devin, who mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard Vanessa was working with some kind of regional food distributor now, and that there'd been talk of a bigger deal in the works. A bigger deal. Those words sat in my head for days. I decided to visit. I told Vanessa I wanted to see her in person, that it had been too long, and she seemed happy about it, maybe even relieved, in a way that made me wonder if some part of her had been waiting for this conversation without wanting to start it herself. When I got to her house, the first thing I noticed was that it wasn't the same house anymore. She'd moved into a newer place on the edge of town, bigger than what a teacher's salary or a modest business could explain on its own, at least not one built from a farmer's market table. We had dinner. She cooked the sauce, of course, and it tasted exactly like it always had, like our grandmother's kitchen, like being 7 years old on a step stool. That familiarity almost undid me. Over dinner, I asked her directly what the business actually looked like now, how big it had gotten, whether there had ever been an agreement about the recipe belonging to both of us. She got defensive fast, faster than I expected, saying she was the one who'd done the work, who'd taken the risk, who'd spent years building relationships with distributors while I was off living my own life. I told her I never asked for a cut of her labor. I only wanted to understand why my name, and more importantly, our grandmother's actual wish, had disappeared from the story entirely. She said the marketing team had simplified things, that it read better with one clear founder narrative, and that she'd always meant to loop me in properly. I left that night without answers I trusted, and a growing certainty that whatever Vanessa was telling me was only part of the truth. The full truth found me by accident, 3 weeks later, at a regional food and farm expo I hadn't even planned on attending. Theo had a work conference nearby, and I'd tagged along mostly to get out of town, wandering the vendor floor with a paper cup of cider while he sat in meetings. I wasn't looking for anything. I certainly wasn't looking for Lewis's table, which is why I nearly walked past their booth entirely before I recognized the label. There was no line at the booth, just a woman in her 30s with a press badge, tasting a sample off a cracker, chatting easily with the booth staff. She introduced herself as Priya Anand, a food journalist who covered small regional brands for a culinary trade publication, and when she found out I recognized the brand personally, her whole face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm reporters get when they think they've stumbled onto a good quote. She told me she'd actually interviewed Vanessa a few months earlier, right after the acquisition. I asked her what acquisition meant.